With Bill C-9 passing here in Canada, Christians in this country are heading towards a very interesting future at an increasingly rapid pace. And each of us needs to evaluate what we believe, why we believe it, and whether or not we're willing to pay a price for those beliefs. Now, that idea of a cost for our faith is a pretty foreign concept to most Canadians. We've enjoyed the benefits of living in a society where we've had freedom of religion and freedom of expression and speech up to this point. But this bill opens up legislation where you can actually face charges for using hate speech, including hate speech that's found in the Bible. So all of us are going to have a choice to make on whether or not we will compromise on our faith and what we believe in, or if we will stand firm on the truth and pay the cost. And you know what? That idea is not foreign to the church through history. All through history, the church has gone through periods of time where it's had freedom and then persecution. But what's interesting is that often in the periods of freedom, the church can actually start to soften and shrink. And then when the cost comes, when persecution comes, that's often the season where the church sees some of its greatest growth, both spiritually, but literally in numbers. And I think, you know what? For all of us that are troubled by this bill, we should actually be excited, because we actually may see a revival start in this country because of pieces of law and legislation like Bill C-9. And I would say this is honestly persecution light. When you go back to first century and all the way forward, you'll see that the persecution that many Christians faced was literally the cost of their life because of their beliefs. So here's the thing, you guys. Maybe we will see some fines and even potential, if it goes really extreme in the future, of jail time. But we have a long ways to go from where the church has been. And you know what? I think we should be excited to actually have a season here where we may see the church start on fire and come back to its true roots of faith, where it is bold again and that it becomes the light in the world. And you know what? I want to ask all of you this. If you don't go to church, start going to church. If you are going to church, ask yourself this question. Are you at a church that will stand firm on the scriptures in the faith and will not compromise the truth? If you find yourself at a church that often sounds more like a motivational speech or a TED Talk, I would recommend that you do this. Start looking for a church filled with people and leaders who are bold and will not compromise. If you don't have the confidence that you're at that church, start looking for another one. This season in time, where the church in Canada has gone silent on social and political issues, is completely over. And here's why. This idea of separation of church and state has actually become quite a twisted doctrine in the church. Reason being, the ideology behind the separation of church and state was never to keep the church or the Christian influence out of the public square, but it was actually there to protect the church from government overreach. And that's exactly what we're seeing here in Bill C-9. Now, the church has no choice but to engage in the public square on political and social issues. Why? Because the government is trying to legislate what they're allowed to preach and teach. And that's where we're actually going to see some very exciting results here. There will be churches that will fall away. And you know what? It might even be the vast majority of churches here in Canada. But God will raise up leaders, men and women who will be bold in their faith, who will not stand down, and who will actually shine the light in the darkness. And you guys, often in seasons where darkness increases, it cannot extinguish the light, and the light grows all the brighter. So don't be discouraged as a Christian here in Canada. View this as a real opportunity to make a difference, to preach the gospel, to see lives changed, and to watch the light overcome the darkness. One of my greatest heroes in the faith is John Bunyan. Now, some of you have probably heard of John Bunyan because he wrote the novel, The Pilgrim's Progress. But what many people don't recognize is the story behind Bunyan. Bunyan, when he wrote that wonderful book, The Pilgrim's Progress, all about the Christian's journey through life and all the different temptations and challenges that they face, he talks about being on the narrow path. But what's very interesting is that John Bunyan wrote The Pilgrim's Progress while he was in prison. I believe he was in prison for 14 years. But here's what's very interesting. John Bunyan was arrested for preaching, and he could have left prison at any moment. All he had to do was sign a promise, a declaration that he would never preach again. And if he would do that, he could walk right out of his jail cell. But he refused, and he paid a very high cost. In fact, in one of Bunyan's letters, he described what it felt like being in prison away from his wife and his blind daughter. And he described it as the literal ripping of flesh off of his bones. And even in the midst of that suffering, he stood firm. He would not compromise on his beliefs. He paid the price. But in that, God took his suffering and used it for such incredible good. Bunyan wrote many wonderful novels, and The Pilgrim's Progress is one of, if not the best-selling book in the Christian world behind the Bible, and it's actually one of the best-selling books of all time across every sector and genre. So here's what I'd like to say to you guys. When we go into seasons where there's persecution, cost, suffering, trials, tribulation, this really accounts for where the church goes through and how God will turn those seasons for good, but it's also directly related to each of you, to all of us personally. Sometimes we go through very challenging seasons in life, and it's in those times of challenges, struggle, loss, illness, you name it, where we really have a decision to make. Will we view our circumstances as purposeless suffering? And will we take that pain on as a burden? Or will we go through those trials and those circumstances and trust God? Will we actually believe that there's no such thing as purposeless suffering and that God will take all things that we go through, including the hard things, and turn them for good? I can say this for myself personally. When I've gone through really difficult seasons of loss and suffering, I've placed my trust in God, and He has, even when I can't understand why in any world I'm going through this, He's used it to grow me, to grow my relationship with Him, my dependency on Him. He's given me joy and peace. And you know what? It's often when I look back in those seasons where it's in the hard times that I see the biggest growth in my life. And sometimes in the easy seasons, I'm really prone to wander. I'm prone to forgetting, I'm prone to distraction, I'm prone to setting my eyes on things that don't really have eternal value. And I think that most of you can probably relate to that sometimes when we're on the hilltop, it's easy to get lazy and to forget all the valleys and all the uphill battles that we had to fight through to get to that hilltop. So here's what I'd like to encourage you with. Regardless of where you find yourself in life, whether you're at a very high season at the mountaintop or a very low and challenging season in the bog of despair, regardless of where you're at, God is with you. He has a plan for your life. And if you place your trust in Him, you will find more joy and fulfillment in your life when you start to set your eyes on things that have eternal value instead of temporal things that pass away. This life is full of joy and also full of sorrow, but it is not void of purpose and meaning. So regardless of where you're at, don't be discouraged. And to all of you who are Christians, let me remind you of this. Even though we may be heading into a very challenging season coming up here, God will use this for His glory and for our good.